Welcome in, everybody, to another episode of Discard for Magic. I'm one of your hosts, Aaron.
And I'm your other host, James or Jexic. And today we're doing something a bit different. We have no guest, and we're going to be talking about tier lists.
We're going to talk about every single faction and where we think they line up based off our personal experience, the matchup data that Plaid Hat has posted, the league data, basically anything we can get our hands on, and we'll line them all up for you.
We're going to be going in release order, so starting with the old Master Set factions. But before we do that, we want to kind of outline what the tiers themselves mean. So at the top, you've got S tier, which is going to be kind of above where you'd probably want factions to be.
Slightly overtuned.
Yeah, slightly overtuned. A tier is kind of the vast swath of decks that we think are pretty good in terms of like making good balanced games. We're going to break that down to A+, A, and A-. Below that will be the B tier, which is factions that are just kind of lacking something to have that competitive edge and that competitive spark that kind of makes them a good tournament pick. But you'll definitely see people using those decks and succeeding with them. And then C tier is just kind of like you might be handicapping yourself a bit if you pick this going into if it pops up in league or if you're taking it into a tournament.
Starting off, we have the Breakers as the first deck we're going to discuss. And we had the Breakers coming in at an A-, fairly in the middle of our tier list.
You know, a lot of people will say that maybe they're ranged reliance. You're fighting an uphill battle when you're using ranged dice the whole time, sometimes. And
they have been called the Heartbreakers for that aspect. Having that ranged dice, basically all you can roll. You got Gul'dun in there, but besides that, that's all you can do is roll the ranged dice and hope for the best, and sometimes it works out. At high level play, I've seen Breakers be very dominant, but I definitely think they have some bad matchups, which make them a little less consistent than some of those like S tier decks.
So next up is the Cave Goblins. Fisk has been well known for saying that Cave Goblins are top tier, but even he has stopped saying that for a bit, and we have them slotted right in at B.
Coming in at the top of the B tier for us. They do well against some of the top factions, but they still have some poor matchups, some of which are very hard to overcome, like the Crimson Order, the Fungal Dwarves, Fallen Kingdom. These are some matchups that are just very difficult to get past as the Cave Goblins.
When it comes to the Fallen Kingdom, we've got them next to the Cave Goblins in the B tier. Aaron, you've played the Fallen Kingdom quite a bit. Maybe you can point out why we put them down there.
Yeah, so the Fallen Kingdom are one of my favorite decks to play. They can be really strong in some matchups, but they have some very glaring matchup weaknesses against a lot of the top decks. They do very poorly against like your Deepwood Groaks, your Savannah Elves, your Polar Dwarves. They struggle with those structures with the Polar Dwarves, and a lot of these matchups really hurt their chances because they're so bad. So their inconsistency really keeps them from being like an A tier deck, in my opinion.
I also think, in general, like the knock on them for a while has also just been the hand management is like a challenge, and sometimes your deck just is in the wrong order for you to succeed. You know, if you get both your blood summons at the bottom of the deck or something like that.
Yeah, it can be rough, especially because the events in Fallen Kingdom are so crucial. And you don't have a good counterplay with the Fallen Kingdom, like your champs are some of the worst in the game, so you don't have a way to switch up what you're doing if you have to burn through your hand fast. You just don't have those other options. So the flexibility is really not there. But when you get some good hands with the Fallen Kingdom, it can go pretty well for you also, especially if you get a Blood Summon turn 1. There is that back and forth, but overall, a B tier for us.
Next up, we've got the Polar Dwarves. They're smack dab in the middle of the A tier. I mean, after the nerfs that they received when they used to be probably the strongest deck in the game, they just seem like a nice balanced and fun deck. It kind of does its own unique thing, and it does it pretty well.
Yeah, I think they're one of the closest to even matchups. They do like fairly well, like close to 50-50 on like most of their matchups.
I'm looking at the tier list or my matchup chart that I have. The only one they have that's above 5.5 or below is the Shimmer Sea Fae. So, so everything else looks like it's between 45 and 55%. It doesn't get much more even than that, aside from maybe someone else will bring up later.
Yeah, so they're very consistent. They're not gonna have some crazy terrible matchups like they used to. They'll be strong in a couple of matchups for sure, but they're not gonna have really any bad matchups either, which makes them, in my opinion, a great tournament pick because you're not getting decided before the game happens. Anything can happen when you got an even matchup.
And also, probably even further, like their games tend to last a bit, so you're not going to be in many situations where like that first turn is so crucial. They just kind of slow roll you either way.
Next up, we have the Savannah Elves, the first one in our S tier. Savannah Elves have long been thought to be one of the best decks in the game, and we agree with that sentiment. I think they got very few bad matchups. I mean, they tend to out-econ most decks in the game.
Some great comments, a couple strong champions, and one that no one ever talks about, and that's okay. The one thing that's tough, I think, about playing them is to have enough magic to keep things summoned on the board because everything's kind of expensive in their deck. So if you're new to them, you might struggle with that aspect of it.
Yeah, using the Aaron don't discard everything with Savannah Elves is not the best idea.
Yeah. The people talk about, what's overpowered about them. I mean, like they often point to Chant of Power, but I think Chant of Power is just a very elegantly designed card because it reuses an ability that's used a lot of other places. So I would never change that card. I know we're not going to talk about changes too much, but my vote is never change Chant of Power. It's cool and it's fun.
Yeah, I think their boost economy is just a little strong, and some of their units stay around a little too long. It's hard to deal with those lionesses and hard to deal with the rhinos, especially when they're running over all your units. And border archers are no slouch by any means.
Yeah, so it's really just they have a strong common suite, and then even like Spirit Mage is a solid common because it can put boosts on a Bua and do other things. So it's not really like their only bad card is a champion, which is negligible.
Yeah, free MIDI tree. Next up, we have the Vanguards, one of the most beloved decks that's been underpowered for a long time. Got a little love with a buff to Sarah a little ways back. We have them falling in the bottom part of the B tier, the very bottom of B tier.
They're still B tier despite the buff. But like in the public data that Joe had, they were actually like right in the middle of the pack at like 48%. So I think at kind of like the casual level, they can be pretty good. But when it comes to tournament play and stuff, they have a real weak range game just because the Citadel Archers and Jacob don't really cut it. And so you're trying, it's hard for them to dictate the flow of the battle in a lot of things. But again, some of the matchups that they can, the ones that people want to come to them, like your Skyspear Avians and Wayfarers and stuff like that, some of those are good matchups for the Vanguard. So they definitely have some. There's some light at the end of that Vanguard tunnel.
And just in case anybody is unsure, we are doing this according to the highest or higher levels of play, not as much towards the general play.
Yeah.
Next up, we got the Phoenix Elves, our second faction in the A- tier. We have them above the Breakers by a couple slots, but still in the A- tier.
Yeah, Phoenix Elves are great if you're one of those people that doesn't like the dice in the game and want to try to plot out your turn a bit and just know that certain things are going to happen. I think that's one of the reasons they were actually like one of the third most popular decks, or maybe even second this year. Just right behind the Deepwood Groaks in terms of popularity. Their main weakness is they have a low health summoner, but they have lots of ways to work around that and to discourage people from attacking her. So yeah, she kind of slots in at A- tier.
Yeah, and with the recent changes, I think that really helped them move up from like a B tier deck with Maldaria's new improved ability. I think the ability to like attack a structure now and get a card back in front of you, including a champ, really gives them a lot more value in some of those matchups that they were really weak in, such as like the Polar Dwarves.
And also like that protection from being shot through really changes like the Skyspear Avian matchup and like any matchup where people want to force the blocker, her blockers got a big change too in terms of with the way her ability works now. So no longer in the basement.
Next up, we have the Tundra Orcs, the second of the starter set.
And we've got them in the B tier. despite having some great matchups into some of the newer factions that just came out, which kind of makes people think that they're doing up, looking up, and they're even used, in the I think by Orange Lazarus in the last tournament. We still think that they've got tough matchups against a lot of the field, and you don't feel like you're in control of the game as you might be with the way you are with some other decks. I think. What do you think, Aaron?
Yeah, I think there's just some of the factions that have a lot of ability to like slow play them or really punish Grognak. And if Grognak gets punished really fast, it's hard for the Tundra Orcs to win that game. And if he's not involved at all, it's also harder for them to win that game. So it's a delicate balance that I feel like is hard for even some players at the highest level to deal with at times.
Yeah.
And some of those decks that you'll notice they're weak against is like the Cloaks, who can really punish Grognak, like the Phoenix Elves, and like the Fallen Kingdom can punish Grognak, and a bunch of these decks that can really put a hurt on Grognak if he leaves himself open, which makes it harder for them to win those games.
I think the other big thing too is that the freeze event doesn't work against things with boosts, and we've seen more and more factions getting boosts, and it's just harder to use that card.
The other aspect is much like the Vanguards, they find themselves with almost no range, which makes them less versatile, especially in the late game if they're left to their own devices and they don't have any ranged units left. Like in a couple of my recent games against Tundra Orcs, I basically knew I was safe in certain instances because there were no shamans left and Targan was dead. So I knew there was not a single ranged unit that my opponent could play, which makes it a lot easier to play around their melee units.
Oh, next up we've got the cloaks, which are another entry into our S tier. Kind of have them towards the bottom of the S tier. Cloaks are just a classic deck in second edition that has a lot of versatility in the way it can be played. It can play a long econ game and a good range poke game and keep away game, but also has the ability to surround your summoner and put you in check, so you'll probably die the next turn. You really can't ever let your guard down against them, and they can also play a good long game too, a good range game. They kind of have all the tools they need.
The Cloaks have a lot of tools to just make it very hard for you to deal with your turns. Like they can use gunners to put people into places where you can't attack them. They can use smoke bomb to make it so you have no good attacks. They have a lot of ability just to get out of dodge after making a lot of attacks on your units. So it makes it very tough to counterplay them, especially because if you get up close and personal, they can really punish you really quickly.
Yeah, and there's always the threat of like dagger just coming behind a unit, so you have to be careful advancing against them. A lot of things to consider. They've maybe gone down a little in our estimation over time, but not much.
Next up, we have the Sky Spear Avians. So Sky Spear Avians we have in our A- tier towards the bottom of that one. They are fairly even in a lot of their matchups, but they got a couple matchups with some lower tier factions that they kind of struggle with, like the Fungal Dwarves and the Vanguards, which are not like top tier factions. Even like the Cave Goblins at times can be a really tough matchup for them.
They have a great range game. They can often dictate where the battle's going to occur, so that's some of their strengths. But their summoner is pretty low health, so when you get into some of those brawls or that kind of stuff, they can struggle.
They also don't have a ton of ability to deal a lot of damage in one turn. They have Battle Song, which helps a little bit, and they have Stewards, but Stewards can be unreliable. So if your entire game hinges on like one big Steward turn, that's real rough if you don't roll the way you need to.
Yeah, they can definitely go 2 out of 3 when you've got the buff going and it doesn't work out for you.
After the Sky Spear Avians, we got coming in with the Eternal Council. Eternal Council comes in our A tier, right below the Polar Dwarves.
Yeah, the Eternal Council are an interesting one because they like the first way to think about them is like as this cannon summoner where you're gonna just load up all your events and just go crazy with her with Edia. And that's certainly one way that they can be played, and it's certainly a way that you can turn the way the battlefield is flowing. But they've got some great commons too, in like the Sage and the Citadel Advisor that can just trade well at range and kind of make it life tough on your opponent. Then they don't want to advance because they're worried that Edia might pop off.
Yeah, and if you can protect Idia while she's gaining boosts, then that makes them all the more dangerous because if she has like 4+ boosts, 6+ boosts, and still close to full health, when you get to that point where she's got the full 8 attack, because it will happen, then that's going to be real rough for you to deal with.
And another aspect too that comes up sometimes is just how useful learn can be against some of the more powerful like active events. So when people are able to steal good things, it just can kind of like just like wait a minute, you've got renewed hope, you've got stuff like that, and suddenly she can be pretty tough to take down.
Yeah, I don't know if people always realize that learn itself can basically like win some matchups for you. Like for example, with the Fallen Kingdom or the Cave Goblins, if you learn Unrelenting or Pyre, those are such crucial events that like you could keep Unrelenting up for 4 or 5 turns, making it impossible basically for the Cave Goblins to beat you. Or you can keep Pyre up for like 3 or 4 turns and heal back to full from like basically dead, and that is incredibly tough to deal with also. After the Eternal Council, we come in with the Fungal Dwarves. I know a thing or two about them.
And they have fallen down to A minus tier.
Yeah, still in the A tiers, but A minus. We have them above the Breakers. But the Fungal Dwarves, they just have not gotten a lot of love lately. They were somewhat middle of the pack, and then in this last wave 4, they have had some of their worst matchups released, and that is devastating. They are abysmal against the Storm Goblins.
And yeah, not great against the Fae either. People talk about rebuke or things like that not being a great event. It's good against the fungal dwarfs. Put that carrier at the bottom, and then you just don't have enough carriers to do what you want to do.
Extremely rough, and they're not good against the Groaks either. The Groaks do very well against them. And even the other factions, the Forged and the Vargrath and the Crimson Order, are all not ideal. Crimson Order might be the best one of those, or the Vargrath maybe. But Wave 4 just really did not help the Fungal Dwarf's case and really pushed him down even further.
And also around the same time, we also got the health nerf, so he's got Codex down to 12.
One less zap with those Storm Goblins. But coming in after the Fungal Dwarves, we have another dwarf group. We got the Obsidian Dwarves. James, you've been playing a lot of them lately. Why don't you take the lead on that one?
Much like my other favorite, the Tundra Orcs, we've got them at B tier. They're A tier in my heart. Once your opponent kind of knows the shtick of how much damage he can do, they're not going to get surprised by it as often. And if people just make a concerted effort to wound Balzar, he's constrained a lot more. Although you can definitely win a lot of games against people that are newer or don't know how explosive the Obsidian Dwarves can be. I think once people understand that at the higher level, it's a less consistent deck, and then sometimes you'll just lose because you're not rolling what you need. Even though I think with willpower and careful use, they're not as overly powerful as some of the other decks. And there's certain matchups they have that aren't as good. And they don't have the strongest range game either, aside from Balzar. You got to get him in there and hope not to take too much damage in the meantime.
Yeah, I think once you figure out Volcanic Blast and like the range to stay out of that range, it takes away a lot of the tricks that they can really do.
There's still some tricks you can pull sometimes with like Ember Demons and Chains. I've also found they were really good when I was playing 45 games that get stronger in a setting where people aren't able to think about all the things. I've lost playing games against Obsidian Dwarves. People play carefully enough. Obsidian Dwarves struggle a bit. So that's kind of why we've got them in B.
Next up, we have the Sand Goblins. Sand Goblins is another S tier for us. Sand Goblins just are super consistent. They have the ability to like deny you magic with the Wrench Rats. They have the ability to do the Super Gate. They have the ability to really get up close and personal and get some assassinations with Silts. and get a ton of range with sparks and thrusters and carry. It's just a lot to counterplay because they have so many different options on how to come at you. And they always basically have a good one. So Sand Goblins are one of the most versatile factions in my mind.
It's hard to play around everything they can do because like sometimes you don't even realize what they can do until you're looking at your hand. Wait a minute, I can win in this otherwise horrible situation that looks awful. I might have a shot at if I do every little trick that they've got. They're just scrappy and fun. They're S tier for us.
Shadow Elves are another S tier faction for us. You'll find that a lot of the S tiers start with S, which seems like a common trend. But the Shadow Elves are a great S tier faction. They have the ability to play the long game and also get some fairly easy assassinations. You got to be very careful with your summoner when you're playing against them because they can get to you from basically anywhere. So if you're at 7 or less health, you're already dead, basically.
And if you're at 1 health, there's no hiding.
Yeah, there's no hiding. They can get you with Samara, they can get you with Pulse, they can get you with a Ranger, they can get you with Glinting Speed, they can get you with like 13 different ways, and you're never going to be able to protect from all of them. It's rough.
They did win the first Tournament of Champions with Vexer when Vexer was still pretty new to the scene, but still very good.
Yeah, the second Tournament of Champions.
The second Tournament of Champions. That was the first one that they were available for.
Yeah, the first one they were there. The first one was won by Donkey with the Fallen Kingdom. There was only like 12 factions way back in the day.
They've been shown to do well at the highest levels in the right hands, even though public data often shows them being a bit weaker. But in tournament play with good players, there's few decks that are better than the Shadow Elves.
Yeah, they just have a lot of options to offer. And I think they suffer, and we'll get to another couple decks that suffer from this also, but I think they just suffer from like the amount of thinking and like high level play, how hard it is to get to that point. I struggle all the time with the Shadow Elves still, but there's some people who pilot them incredibly well. They are terrifying to play against.
Next up, we've got the Wayfarers, who are in the A+ tier. Wayfarers are kind of interesting in that their most straightforward way to play often works, but they do have a good plan B in Seek the Horizon and playing with dancers and doing some other stuff. So they're not as much of a one-trick pony as you would think in terms of just trying to go assassinate the summoner. They are the best in the game at assassinating the summoner when you want to do that, probably, except maybe Shadow Elves.
Yeah, Slip By is a super strong card, and that's just one of the ways they can get to you. But Wayfarers, they just don't have a lot of bad matchups. They do pretty well against everybody, and they can get to your summoner all the time. And contrary to popular belief, they can win if they play just on their side of the battlefield too, which is, I know it's incredible to think, but building a wall across just doesn't completely stop their game plan. They can still win.
Well, yeah, they've got good tools for trading places and controlling the battlefield with dancers and other stuff. So they do have other tools. And like Boldo is just a standout champion that can be used in so many ways.
One of the best in the game. But moving on from the Wayfarers, next we have the High Elves.
And they are an A+ for the High Elves.
Yeah, A+ for the High Elves. So the High Elves are another one of those factions like we talked about with the Shadow Elves who really struggle in general play because of the amount of ability that needs to go into high level play. High Elves are very, very strong, but their auras are sometimes tough to get your head around because of the fact that you can give your enemies just as many buffs as you're giving yourself. That aspect can make them more difficult to play, but they do pretty well in most of their matchups, and they don't really have any bad ones. Tundra Orcs being one of their worst ones, but I mean, they just don't have a lot of bad matchups. They do pretty well against everybody.
Interestingly enough, we're going to be staying in A+ when we get to the next faction, the Swamp Orcs.
Yeah, Swamp Orcs we had just above the High Elves. Another one of those factions that suffer from being hard to wrap your head around. But once you wrap your head around them, they can be super strong. They hit harder than anybody else in the game. They have unlimited amount of dice basically that they can throw with their summoner.
And they can do it twice.
Or even 3 times. They can throw it all over the place. So 5 health commons, 5 health parapets, 5 health whatever you want to throw out there. That normally is safe to survive a turn is never safe when you're playing the Swamp Orcs.
We already did the Swamp Orc thing, but I think the biggest thing with them is learning to summon guys without attacking with them. You can just put stuff out and get boosts on them. That's the big thing. Grow their as if they're able to grow their swamp, they can do whatever they want with Muglug essentially, and your opponent just has to try to play around her at that point.
And that is very difficult to do, especially because you can use those Vine-Mancers to just pull Mug back to safety or regenerate some of that health. It's just a tough faction to play against.
All right, so that's the end of wave 3.
Going into wave 4.
All right, so we got the Crimson Order next, and this is funny, but Crimson Order are also an A plus.
Yeah, we're staying in the A plus tier. So Crimson Order are one of the factions that they can just outlast basically anybody because of their Undying Cultists, because of all their events that give them so much econ, like Convert and Transfuse and Call Forth. If they can get some healing on with the Baron throughout the game, they have the ability to go for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, it often feels like the way to beat them is to attack their low health summoner, especially if he's damaged himself a bit and hasn't been able to heal. But it can be really hard to get to him. So, there's few factions that are able to consistently get at him early. And those that can are generally the S tier ones.
Yeah, and with dealing with their warriors, those warriors can hit super hard, and they don't have a lot of cost to do so. And they'll stick around normally for a turn or two. So, a difficult faction to deal with, and sometimes that Undying Cultist can really rub some people the wrong way. Next up, though, we have the Mountain Vargath coming in at A tier.
Yeah, and they're basically the epitome of an A tier deck. They've got pretty even matchups across the board. It seems real straightforward at first, but then you get into learning how to use all their movement tricks and placement things, and there's a lot of room for creative play in that as well. And they've just got some bulk to a lot of their units that makes it hard for them to get wiped out very often. So you can kind of build up your magic, summon a champion or two, and just sort of punch with the best of them. That's why they're in the A tier.
Yeah, and just across the board, they're basically like 50-50 on every matchup. It's incredible how much the Vargath do to just be like even in every matchup. It's fantastic to see. Coming after the Vargath, though, we have a highly debated faction. We have the Deepwood Groaks, and we created our own tier for the Deepwood Groaks. The SS tier, above S.
As we're looking over the matchup data, the public data, every kind of data, a lot of things are just showing that the Deepwood Groaks are overperforming right now. And they don't have any bad matchups. Their worst matchups are like, oh, well, that's a 5-0. That's an even matchup with some of the other strong decks like the Forged and the Crimson Order. So they match up well against some of the other S tiers like the Savannah Elves. But the interesting thing is very few of their matchups are actually worse than 60. Or like more polarized. So they don't have that many super polarized matchups. Just that every matchup is even or good for them to the point that they're just above everything else right now.
And they have probably the best common suite in the entire game. Wardens are phenomenal, and they don't get the spotlight as much as Seers, who can be super frustrating to play against if they're sitting in the back row with 5 boosts on them, shooting who knows where. But even like Mystics are super strong, and Warriors are really
You haven't
good.
mentioned Warriors, yeah. Pretty much anything you try to do against them, there's got to be another plan A and plan B. You can't just say, well, rush them. Well, okay. Well, what happens when you rush them? You probably get hit by a warrior if you're not careful. Like, you have to do everything in an extra step to be prepared for what they can do. But I think when you know their threat ranges, I mean, if the Deepwood Groaks have a weakness, it could be that they don't have that much threat range, aside from, like, I guess Seers having infinite range against commons. But you know what they can do, and then you try to play around that as best as you can. But you also have to play around 2 or 3 other things at the same time. They kind of get you in a pickle.
Yeah, and I don't think it helps that like with Wardens with Protect and with like Swift Potion, that makes Heck their summoner super slippery. Like I know frogs are slippery, but like so slippery. There's so many games I've seen, my own, other people's, where Heck gets down to like less than 3 health, and you can't finish the job because you can't get to her with Wardens and with Swift Potions and with all these ways to keep Heck away from things. It's mind blowing how long that silly frog can survive.
It's almost like sometimes you get your wins because people are able to be more overconfident with them, and they're like, okay, well, I got them because they were playing Grokes and they weren't necessarily trying to play protected because they didn't think they had to yet.
Yeah, it's tough for sure. But moving on to the next one, we have the Forged, which would be another A plus tier. The Forged are an interesting faction. A lot of people think they aren't super strong because of the limited ability they have to move. But man, Inventor just getting up and close and personal and slamming stuff down is pretty strong, and they still are pretty good defensively also if you try and push on them. So they do pretty well in a lot of matchups. They don't really have a bad matchup, and they have great win rates in the public data.
Although they aren't doing quite as strong for us in our estimation as the Sand Goblins, they kind of have some of those vibes in terms of summon during the build phase and just have that flexibility for all their units. So I mean, that's a big thing with them.
Yeah, they do probably struggle a little bit if you can hurt the Inventor and get that final blow in, but the Inventor's so good at holding up and just staying protected that there's not a ton of factions that can really get to the Inventor once the Inventor has protected himself. Wayfarers maybe being one, or Storm Goblins, but there's just not a lot of factions who really have that option. Now we're moving on to the final two factions, our two newest factions, and we will start with the Shimmer Sea Fae.
We've got them down in the C tier all alone. As a lot of people have noted, they're a lot of fun, and like when you get everything to work, it feels great. They're this aggressive faction that can steal spaces and push people's gates and move their own gates forward and do all this stuff and just have all these, and like summon things during the attack phase and really just steal all the spots. But it's like all these little, I feel like you're juggling. You're juggling all these balls in the air, and if one of them, you're gonna get punished. And it can be hard to seal the deal, or they don't have that much extra reach at the end. So sometimes you'll get your opponent's summoner down to a couple health, and you're just not gonna be able to finish it. You'll run out of deck, and you lose. There's definitely some players that have shown they can do well with them, but it just feels like an uphill battle every time.
Yeah, they're a faction that I'm sure we still need to figure out a little bit, but as of right now, they just feel a little underwhelming, a little bit weaker than everybody else in the field. And they don't feel like they have a lot of that versatility to go a lot of different ways and play a lot of different ways. They feel like they have their play style of like, we have to press forward, we have to get some champs out, we have to use Nymeria, the summoner, a lot. And that's just what they have to do, and they can be successful doing that. It's just a little bit harder than the rest of the faction.
And then last up, we have the Storm Goblins, who we've got in the A tier. This is one that could probably change volatility over time, just because right now it seems like they've got more matchups that are above and below the center line. So just kind of the nature of the deck with the circuit and all that, it's like some certain decks they're gonna do well with, like the against the Vanguards, for example. Then like the Wayfarers just don't care, crack in the face, and it's over. So, but right now all those matchups kind of balance out, and it looks like they're about a 50% sort of deck. So we have them in the A tier, but I think that could definitely change, or as just people learn to play as or against them a bit better, because they're a bit less easy to map out, I think, how to play than some other decks and how to play around them as well. Like you have to, it's like you're playing a different game. Storm Goblins at the table.
Yeah, so, and their matchups are so polarizing that this could change wildly with like more play with them. But some of their matchups are so good, and some of their other ones are so bad. But playing just that different mindset of just spreading your units out and just making sure they can't run a current through them is just it's a weird way to play, and it doesn't work with every faction. Like Bungle Dwarves really struggle with that aspect because how are you going to keep units close to Kuldak if you spread them all out?
I tried doing the Fungal Dwarves game one time where I just like ran things out, used Stimsher, tried to play Demand. I think I almost killed Thrak, but didn't quite get there.
Yeah, it's just a different mindset. It can be done, but a lot of those factions like to bunch, whether it's Fungal Dwarves, Crimson Order, Vargrath,
Vanguards.
High Elf, Vanguards. A lot of the factions, Fallen Kingdom, Cave Goblins, they like to bunch up and they like to get a bunch of units close together, and that's what the Storm Goblins love. So
So yeah, like this is one where like if we had to do this again in a year, I wouldn't be surprised if they were S tier or C tier, just as people either figure them out one way or the other. Like
They definitely could move a fair amount, but we'll just have to sort of wait and see where they end up. Going from the top to the bottom, we have the Deepwood Groks at SS tier, and then we have in the S tier Shadow Elves, Sand Goblins, Savannah Elves, and Cloaks. A plus tier, we have Swamp Orcs, High Elves, Forge, Crimson Order, and Wayfarers. And then the A tier, we have Mount Vargrath, Polar Dwarves, Eternal Council, and Storm Goblins. A minus tier is Phoenix Elves, Fungal Dwarves, Breakers, and Skyspear Avians. And then the B tier is Cave Goblins, Fallen Kingdom, Obsidian Dwarves, Tundra Orcs, Vanguards, and then in the C tier, the Shimmer Sea Fae.
all right.
Overall, I think a solid list. Let us know if you have anything you disagree with or want to fight us about. We'll be more than happy to discuss.
Fight it out in the Discord or wherever else. The thing about tier lists and all these things is it only takes a few players, I think, to really show that a faction can do better or worse than we know. You know what I mean? Like I think before Vexer and other people took the Shadow Elves out, people weren't really sure how good they were. These can change over time just as certain players get really good with them and just show what a faction's capable of. You know, that's I think one thing that can change, but also tier lists can change over time as just the matchups change with the new decks that are added. And we also want to highlight that this is think of for competitive play. It shouldn't stop you from playing your favorite deck with your friends or even on the ladder. Try to rank up and get the top 10 badge and do all the things and just have fun with it. Just because we say such and such is
this is just our opinion on the tiers, and we are coming from a place we think of a bit of knowledge on it with the amount of games that we've played and the research we've done on it, but we definitely could be wrong on several of these, and don't take it for the gospel. Like there's many of these that I would love to see people prove us wrong on some of these and have factions be stronger or weaker than we think they are.
Yep, I agree on that.
Well, we appreciate you guys listening to this episode. Let us know in the comments or in the Discord what your thoughts are, and we'll see you guys in a couple weeks. This has been Discard for Magic.